Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the main stage at Data Science Festival. It's so great to see so many of you here. And I was going to say, the thing I was going to say, I'm not going to say. But I was going to say, we might have people coming in during this session. So if you do have any spare seats next to you, if you just bunch up to the person next to you towards the middle, that would be great. It's just so we can fill in seats as we go along. And we had some amazing first speakers kick us off. We had Annie and Ray from Utility Warehouse. And next we have Craig Sexuaer, who is talking to us all about unlocking A/B testing for B2B. And Craig, I'm sure he's about to introduce himself, but he leads the experimentation at Statsig, who are one of our lovely sponsors for today's event and driving the development of experimental tools. So I'm going to hand over to Craig. Take it away.
Thank you. Awesome, the mic is working. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here. Like mentioned, I'm Craig, and I lead the experimentation team at a company called Statsig in Seattle in the United States. I've been in London this week to chat with folks about experimentation. The city's wonderful, and I'm very jealous because in Seattle it's always rainy and foggy, and the weather here is beautiful, and I've been told it's like that all the time. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about experimentation generally. I'm not sure how familiar folks are. Could I get like a show of hands for how many people are actually using experimentation in their jobs today? Okay, so we've got a good mix. So we'll do like a quick sort of turbo intro to that. But we're going to spend most of our time together on some of the challenges and tools around B2B experimentation, which is business to business, where you're not experimenting on users, but on industry partners or companies. If you don't work in that space, you don't have to get up and leave. A lot of this is relevant to more than just B2B, but there's a specific set of challenges that are kind of interesting and kind of worth chatting about. I'll keep this brief. I mentioned Statsig, so we're a modern product development platform. Our core product, I'm biased because it's my team, but is an experimentation platform. We also have feature management, rollout monitoring, analytics, metric management. They all sort of play together to help people measure rollouts. This isn't a sales pitch. It is actually relevant. A third of the companies we work with have B2B in their portfolio or are just a B2B company. And they operate differently. This was a learning experience for me when we started working with these folks. My background was at Meta, which is very, very B2C. You're working with hundreds of millions of users when you run experiments. And switching to companies running experiments on a population of 500 to 1,000 companies is a whole different set of challenges. And generally, when people think about experimentation, they think about B2C. They think about Google hyper-optimizing the color of a button, or Microsoft's Bing experimentation team legacy, or Facebook, or Netflix. And so I was a little skeptical when we started with this, when people kind of introduced the problems they were dealing with. And it was sort of a co-development process to figure out how you tackle these challenges. And we'll get into what those are. But one thing I want to point out is when you think about what a B2B company is, we have this little customer list down here. And I think everyone who's familiar, Atlassian has Jira, they have Bitbucket, they have a couple other very B2B tools. Businesses buy these. Users don't really sign up for a Jira account unless they're really masochistic. But also, if you look at this, OpenAI, most ChatGPT is their direct-to-consumer app, but they're also an API service, right? That is extremely B2B. Whatnot, which people might have less familiarity with here, is a live streaming platform for kind of auctioning off things that you open live. So you like open cards live, and then you can buy the card you watch someone open. And so it's B2C, but you also have content producers who are functioning like businesses on your platform. So the point I'm making is that a lot of companies are working with customers, but have something within their product that actually functions like a business that they're working with when they're running experiments. So before we get started, let's talk about why we want people to experiment. In general, there's two ways you can make product decisions or business decisions. You can use intuition, or you can use information or data. This is a caricature that's really common in the experiment community, and it's called the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion. And very often you'll find that is what makes decisions. And it's interesting because it's not the worst framework of all time. Theoretically, the highest paid person is highest paid for a reason. It's not always true, as I'm sure some people have experienced, but there's probably some sort of experience or good intuition there. However, it's really hard to challenge this, and that's where data is really useful. Data is used to challenge assumptions, to challenge sort of the status quo of a decision. And experimentation is a really powerful tool there because experimentation lets you establish causality. By randomizing, you can take a fairly heterogeneous population and wash out that heterogeneity. So when you're looking at the results, you can attribute the change to exactly what you did and nothing else. Now, in practice, that's not always the easiest thing to do, but it is the most powerful tool we have that's commonly available for doing this. Randomized controls trials are just really powerful, and that's why there's such an industry around them. At the same time, there can be a lot of skepticism about experiments. And I think it's common to say that's because they're doing it wrong, or I'm obviously in the position of selling experimentation, so it's very tempting to say that. But a lot of the times, there's very valid reasons that experimentation can be really hard for people to do. For example, if you're at a small company and you have really small sample sizes, I think everyone who's run experiments has run into this issue of you just don't get results. And so you're trying to tell your organization to do this. There's never actual useful information. You just burn a lot of social capital trying to force people to do this thing. But the value in it really is, if you get it going, it's in being surprised. Like I mentioned, it's about challenging assumptions. So the stats are, even at companies that win a lot of their experiments are shippable, only about a third end up shipping. And a third do nothing. And a third actively are bad for the product. And I often say that the real value is you're not shipping that last third, right? You're not putting bad things in your product. Because if you drive a 20% regression in your product, you need a 25% win to catch back up. The other part is learning. You can learn where to double down, and you can learn not to spend effort. I think there was a really good point made in the last presentation about how development time is expensive, like your time is expensive. And so knowing where to spend it is super, super valuable to an organization. And then the other thing to realize is like everyone is running experiments. This is Sean Taylor's very active in the experimentation community, and this is a quote from him that basically just says, everyone is running experiments. Only some of them have control groups and randomization. And what does this mean? Colloquially, an experiment is just trying something, right? In industry, you'll get in a lot of trouble if you talk about anything but a randomized controls trial, which I have my own feelings about. But in general, like every business is trying to learn. If you try something and you look at observational data, it's not ideal, but you are probably getting some directional information that's valuable to the business. It's not just a terrible idea. Like you can't not try things as a business. You'll die. You need to innovate. The issue is a lot of people don't measure, right? People don't actually think critically about what they're doing. They assume they're right. And everyone, I think, in this room has probably run into a situation where at the end of some period of time, it hasn't worked. And if you haven't been measuring, it's really hard to start post hoc understanding what happened. And so the whole pitch here is that by kind of continuously monitoring every change, you have a pretty strong directional checkpoint to constantly know if you're going in the right direction, and also to look back and say, hey, where did I go wrong? When you do. Everyone makes mistakes. No product team is perfect. Making decisions is really hard. There's a reason data is an industry. So that's my, not 2-minute, but a couple-minute pitch on experimentation. So you might be asking, how does this work for B2B? Why do we care about the distinction of B2B and experimentation? So let's talk a little bit about B2B just to set this up. When B2B companies are growing, there's usually sort of 3 buckets of how they try to get business. They each address acquisition, retention, expansion in a different way. Sales-led is very led by the sales team, like you might imagine from the name. It's very high touch. It's very personalized. You're building specific features for specific people on demand. Marketing-led growth is all about awareness at the top of the funnel. And the idea is people know enough about your product that they come in ready to use it and ready to understand how it works. Often, this is all through website conversions. Product-led growth is kind of the freemium tier, or things where there's virality and there's a really obvious call to action around why you would do this. Cursor is a very recent and obvious example. It's a $20 subscription that has some insane amount of ARR. I don't even know the number today, but in the hundreds of millions. And this is all about making a really good product that people love, and they talk about it and do the marketing for you. Now, what's interesting is that experimentation is a really bad idea often for the first tier. How do you experiment when each person is that different and bespoke and has different needs? For marketing-led growth, we normally see this on optimizing the landing experience. You're doing this engine, building this engine, where you're trying to get a lot of people landing on your website interested in trying. So you want to optimize that really valuable top of funnel. For product-led growth, experimentation is within the product, right? You want to make the best possible product, and you want to test and build viral loops. You want to get people talking about the product, showing off the product. Anyone who's opened LinkedIn in the last year has surely seen the term vibe coding. Very, very successful example, right? So when they're doing these tests, in normal A/B testing, the standard practice is you randomly assign users to test or control. This ensures an individual user has a consistent experience. If I'm in test for the duration of the experiment. I'm not flickering the screen every time I reload. And you can attribute user-level behaviors, again, to what I did in the experiment. In B2B, this doesn't work super well, and that's because human beings talk to each other. The test group interacts with the control group, and this violates a fundamental assumption we use when A/B testing, that the test group and the control group are completely independent. Imagine you roll out a new dashboard to half your users, and they send a screenshot or share a link to their team. Half of the team is not in the experiment. They get a 404. You have completely polluted the data, right? People know about it. People are getting weird experiences in the control group when they try to click on things their colleagues are sharing. And so it's just, you don't have any causal separation. Really, you just can't do anything with that information. So what do we do? Normally, what we end up doing is doing organization-level randomization. So this eliminates the intra-org interference, and it measures our experimental effect within an organization more effectively. We minimize this cross-talking between buckets. Obviously, people will talk to their colleagues at other companies. Maybe people are working 2 jobs. I know that's popular these days. But it solves most of the problem. And it's great, right? And obviously, a leading question, no, this introduces a new problem. We had maybe tens of thousands of users, and now we have tens of organizations. Our sample size has dropped dramatically, usually orders of magnitude. And folks who have run experiments know sample size is the easiest lever to change in terms of getting significant results, especially when you're dealing with noisy data. Additionally, organizations are not all created equal. They're highly heterogeneous, and even more so than users. Imagine an experiment where you have a million-person multinational corporation, and then on the other side of the experiment, you have the coffee shop down the street. You're not really going to be able to draw good comparisons between those two. You need a lot of sample if you're going to let that wash out due to randomization. So these are kind of the core challenges, and I'm going to walk you through a checklist today and kind of talk through the problem, the tools, and I'll be honest with you, we don't have perfect solutions for all of this. Experimentation is a developing science. At the end of the day, information is perfect. Imperfect. Don't quote me on that. I would like it to be perfect. Freudian slip. So what are the challenges? Managing opt-in and opt-out. Who gets experiments? What control do they have over that experience? The unit of the analysis is not the unit of randomization. Metric sensitivity is a huge issue. You have underpowered experiments like I mentioned. You have extremely right-skewed data, meaning there's outliers that drive most of the distribution. And heterogeneous effects matter a lot. So we'll get into that. On the opt-in and opt-out side, let's talk about an example, and this is my last metaphor, I promise, of a plane. So we have some people in first class. These are your VIP customers. They have strict SLAs. They expect no bugs. They expect to get everything first at the same time. So we don't really want to test on these folks. We can get into a lot of trouble. But in business class, we also have people who expect access to new features as soon as possible. They don't want to be lagging behind the rest of the people in your plane. they would get really upset hearing that other customers happened to be in test and got a feature before them. Then we have customers in our I guess, premium economy, and these are kind of our loyal customers. They've been with us a really long time, and counterintuitively, often they don't like change, right? They like the product how it is. They're very resistant to getting features, especially if you introduce bugs or give them kind of a crappy, half-baked experience. So often, you don't launch new features there until they're ready. And then lastly, we have sort of the discount fare class. This is often freemium in B2B, and this is a kind of larger population where there's not guarantees, and often this is where experimentation happens in B2B. They don't have restrictive expectations, and they're just kind of happy to get new features as they come out. The tool here, and apologies if my motivation isn't pure, is to have a feature management system that's very flexible to this targeting. You want to be able to say who is in getting what, and have that really automated and templatized across your organization so there's not mistakes being made. Atlassian is a very good example of this, right? If they're working with the US government, they have to be pretty careful to not give them some random test that potentially causes issues. And I'll be, again, really honest here, this isn't a complete solution. I think the obvious thing you might have noticed is that there's going to be a huge generalization problem if you're only running experiments in economy, right? It's a different set of expectations and a different response people will have to the same feature. Often economy is going to be smaller companies, they're going to be doing a different profile of work. And so this is tricky. I think this is kind of the first refrain you'll hear me say a lot, is this is tricky, and it requires a plug-in of sort of business sense and thinking, which unfortunately I can't solve that problem for everyone. But a lot of this is, well, okay, the people in first class, there's usually a couple dozen of them. You can talk to them in B2B. That's something really nice that I've learned being at a B2B company now, is people are very motivated to work with you. The number of Google Drive checklists I've gotten from folks of feature requests is in the hundreds now. And so you sort of have to just be aware of what you're not able to measure. Next up, unit of analysis is not the unit of randomization. And we mentioned this earlier. You might be curious about user-level metrics, but you can only randomize on the organization level. So what do you do here? This is a best practice in experimentation. You want to be measuring the same thing you are changing. If you were running a user-level experiment, it would be insane to try to measure the country-level results. It's a straw man, but you kind of get where I'm going with that. So there's a couple things you can do here. But the most common result is you end up doing normalization. So what you do is you look at a metric per user. So if I am a B2B company, I'll measure the clicks per user in the company. This has two major advantages. One, it helps normalize, right? You can imagine that an organization having 1 million times the click volume of another is not uncommon, but their individual users having that level of drift would be kind of crazy. There's some correlation there probably. Probably the big orgs are using the tool a lot more, but it's not 1,000,000x. Second, it's easy for people to understand. I think being in the business, the biggest single problem with metrics, and hopefully there's some agreement here, is people don't interpret them well. So imagine you're looking at an experiment readout and the average clicks is 95,000. What does that mean? That clicks per user being 20 is a lot easier to kind of comprehend in terms of what the actual user experience was when you've made your change. So that's why people end up doing this a lot, but it introduces complexity. You need a mapping between users and companies. You need to have your data tagged with both, and you need to be able to sort of trust that that math is good. The other thing is that it's a ratio metric, which comes with its own baggage. You need to use the delta method to account for the covariance I mentioned, so there's some level of correlation between the number of clicks and the number of clicks per user. And you also need to report on the components. This is where it gets a little annoying, where if your clicks per DAO move, is it because clicks went up or DAO went down? You need to be able to really quickly understand that change and the mix shift effect you're getting. Metric sensitivity is a very common topic, not just in B2B, but in B2C as well. But selecting the right metric can be really hard in any context, and it's especially hard in the B2B space. People often pick I think there's two defaults we see, is people either go straight for the throat and try to measure like the ultimate business outcome, often revenue, or they say, I don't even care about that. I'm only going to measure clicks. I will measure like the first thing the user can see. And what we always recommend is you want to have a stair step from clicks to revenue. And you have to be smart about what you are expecting to be able to measure. Most experiments at a big company cannot move the top line metric. And if you do, congratulations on the promotion. In B2B, I think it's more legitimate that you'll have kind of crazy metrics. For us, Statsig, people are often on yearly contracts. So ideally, I'd want to measure renewal rate. I've made the experience better. People like it. They tell the person who controls the money, hey, please keep paying for this. Okay, so I guess we wait a year, right? That's not going to happen. You can get at that with long-term holdouts or some level of predictive metrics, but those have their own issues. So what's the best thing you can do? And again, the answer here is not an answer. It's what is the best thing you can do? How do you manage this problem? Proxy metrics are really helpful. Kind of ladder down from, okay, well, what makes people renew? You can talk to them. You can say, hey, what are the problems you're having? What would make you not renew? And then you can measure the things they tell you. Or you can measure things that you have seen correlate in the past. I think doing retros with customers is really, really powerful. You know, if you see people falling off the bandwagon, you can talk to them after. People enjoy sharing complaints. And so you can get a good signal on what wasn't working and start measuring that for other customers. You can also use this concept of metric trees, right? If you have an ultimate metric you care about, you can build a framework, often some sort of tree diagram of what ladders up to that. And then you can measure those components sort of as, again, a stair step up to the thing you ultimately care about. And the last note is that if you don't have a lot of statistical power, you want to measure as high up in the funnel as possible, because that's where the users are. That's where you're going to have a lot of sample, you're going to have a lot of activity. And so you need to make sure when you're running power analysis, which I'll talk about in a second, you're running it at the right level of granularity. Be realistic about what you can measure, and try to measure the things you want to measure. The last note I'll make on this, which is kind of in the weeds but is very dear to my heart, is you often want to measure binomial metrics instead of continuous metrics. So I think a very common thing is measuring revenue. If I try to measure revenue at most companies, I will almost never get a result without a lot of users in my test. And that's because there is a ton of variance coming from the fact that a small percentage of users have 100x the revenue of everyone else. Variance has a squared term. It does not like outliers. The most powerful way to solve this is, in addition to measuring that, measuring binomial metrics for, say, number of users over $30, number of users over $100, and you have this continuum. That can be 10, 20 times more sensitive than just measuring the raw value. I have a blog on this if people are curious about it. But so let's say you've picked better metrics. You have your battery of sort of ladder up metrics. All right, sometimes your test will still be underpowered. So what do you do? Unfortunately, I'm going to tell you to use power analysis, which is never fun. But power analysis is where you do pre-analysis to understand, given the variance you see in your population, and given the traffic you expect to see, what kind of results and what kind of, what's your MDE? What is the effect you'll be able to see? And you can orient your decisions around that. So minimum detectable effect is this concept where, given a population and given a metric, you can estimate what is the smallest effect size that I'll be able to reliably observe a statistically significant result on. So let's say our MD is 50%. Unless you think your change is going to be 50%, it's probably a non-starter. So power analysis, I think for me, like the reason it's so valuable is it helps you be honest and helps you align people. I think a very, very common pattern is people running a power analysis. They say, well, there's no way that this is going to be statistically significant, but you still have to run the test. And I'm not going to be happy about you shipping it if you don't get the statistically significant result. And then people are very surprised when in 3 months nobody trusts them and nobody wants to work with them. It's tough. I think, working as a data person, which I assume a lot of folks here are, you have to work within the bounds of your organization, and you have to work within the bounds of reality around the data you're using. And that matters here too. And power analysis lets you do that. Power analysis lets you have an informed conversation with your team of, hey, I don't think we'll be able to measure this. I would love it if we could run the experiment just to have the data point, but we shouldn't block on this. We shouldn't expect this to be moving things. That said, I'm not trying to say you can just never experiment. You want to also use power analysis to pick the right metric, right? You can run power analysis on multiple metrics and say, well, I don't expect to move this one, but we should be able to see this proxy moving. And that's what we should sort of target to understand if our change did anything. And often that is the metric you end up using, is the first metric. Like, if we changed a page, I should expect to see clicks or something go up. There's also going to be variance reduction, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next slides. And one thing I'll call out as well is one-sided and non-inferiority tests are a really powerful tool. I think in experimentation, a lot of the literature is very dogmatic. It's 95% two-sided t-test. But using a one-sided test, if you only care if it goes up, well, that's really helpful. You've doubled your power. If you only care that it doesn't go down, do the same thing, but just look out for a decrease. Both of these can kind of help you understand, well, okay, if our ship criteria is just not screwing things up, we can measure it this way, and it's a lot more powerful. These trade-offs are actually kind of the core toolkit around underpowered experiments. It's understanding what you can move. Hey, we have a high risk tolerance. Let's run this with 80% confidence. Or let's just use a Bayesian experiment and try to understand if it's directionally correct. At the end of the day, it's kind of up to you to understand what the risk tolerance is within your organization and how precisely you need to measure things. But often getting a partial piece of insight with that causal inference is better than getting nothing at all. I'll briefly talk about variance reduction because this is very in vogue right now. But Cupid is kind of the most common terminology for this. And it's a great acronym because it makes no sense. It's supposed to be Cupid, but it's controlled experiment using pre-experimental data. This was coined by Microsoft in a paper from a while ago. But what it is using pre-experimental data to correct for variance in the post-experimental data. And it removes a major source of variability, which is that users are heterogeneous. If I want to run a test where I put 20-pound weighted vests on people and see if they run faster or slower with the vests on, if I have 30 people, I'm going to see a ton of variance in their times, right? People are going to be all over the place. It's actually going to be, in some cases, hard to get a read on how much this makes a difference in a 400-meter dash. But if I have them come the day before and do a 400-meter dash without a weight, and I look at how much that changed, I'm betting I'll get pretty consistent results that they're slower with the weight on. And that is the core insight behind this technique. As long as your pre-experimental data, or whatever your covariate is in this regression, has nothing to do with the assignment, it's not influencing the assignment, and it's orthogonal independent, you can pretty much plug anything in here. It turns out that often just people's behavior, the same behavior before the experiment, is the most predictive thing. When we apply this in practice, we normally see confidence intervals reduced by something between 30 to 60% when it works. In a lot of cases, it doesn't work super well, especially user-level tests. You can imagine users' behavior on a lot of apps is not consistent week over week, especially for things like websites where this is Europe, so cookies are kind of a hairy conversation. But in B2B, we actually see much more reduction. It's often 60 to 80%. And think about it for a second. But B2B metrics are pretty predictable and durable for two reasons, right? You have an inherent averaging out. So in an organization, you have like 1,000 users. And if you created 250 documents this week, you probably create about the same amount next week. And also, something we have going for us is people are paid to use our product. There is like an inherent mechanism by which people come back and do the same thing every week in these experiments. So this is a really especially effective tool here. You can see on the chart here, what this is looking, it's actually, I think the same example, so it's fake data, I apologize, but an experiment I made up where we have people running. And when you account for the pre-experimental data, we're shrinking the spread of our distribution. And so when we're sampling from that distribution, we see a lot less variance. And it's easier to tell here that there is a real difference between these two populations on the chart on the right post-adjustment. There's a bunch of other variance reduction methods out here. This is kind of the bleeding edge, I would say, of experimentation right now. Some of these have really, really brutal trade-offs. I think Cupid is sort of the one that is talked about a lot because it's kind of free. Besides complexity and computation cost, it has good assumptions. You kind of just get more power without doing anything. And modern platforms generally just manage this for you. Some ones I'll call out. So we have like a cure extension to Cupid, but this is a fancy way of saying we ran a multivariate regression, which it's fun to have like the cutting edge technology be 100-year-old technology. Bayesian priors are really common. There's a high risk profile there, but Bayesian priors are, if you're running a Bayesian test, you can come in with an expectation of what the test will do. I think everyone can see the incentives problem there, but it's very, very powerful if you have a bunch of tests you've run before to establish a baseline. Other things, paired t-tests, when possible, are the best tool out there. Anyone who's used ChatGPT has seen the thing where they show you two responses. The sensitivity on that 1-0 of which one they click is absurd. It's 50 to 100 times more powerful than a standard test. We also see this a lot in interleaving tests for ranking. SPRT is the last one I'll call out. A lot of platforms use MSPRT, which is sequential probability ratio tests, for doing sequential testing techniques. You can peak without problems. But SPRT itself is a really powerful technique. Instead of measuring a null hypothesis and trying to reject it, you measure the likelihood ratio between your variants, and then you pick a threshold at which you say, hey, it's likely enough that this is better, so I'll pick that one. Moving on to the next issue, it's skewed data. A few whales can drive a lot of metrics. Here we have a histogram of a metric value. You can see that there's a couple of people out there on the right that are going to cause issues. There's two common ways people handle this in B2C, and that's Windsorization and capping. You take all those values above the 99th percentile and you say, well, you're at the 99th percentile now. This is great. Again, variance has a squared term. We're reducing the variance often when we look at customer data by like 90% just by doing this. And for users, this is generally just a no-brainer. Most of the time, that person out there all the way on the right is a bot or someone messing with your data, or if you have client-side logging for your app, they figured out that they can go to the inspector and run a for loop. So it's just generally good to clean this up. It's very fun looking at people's top-line values, and I think I had a customer whose time spent was longer than the age of the universe. I messaged them about that. They didn't seem to think it was that funny. But the issue is, in B2B, you really care about outliers, right? That is probably your most important client out there on the right. It's not like a logging issue. It is fundamentally important to your business. So what do you do? And again, sorry to out myself, there's not like a clear answer here. I think bucketing is the most common thing we see, is people measure things by buckets. It's what's the revenue in our small bucket? What's the revenue in our large bucket? What's the revenue in our big bucket? And we also measure the overall, but you sort of understand the compositional change here. And we even see people go as far as to take, measure each company as an internal A/B test. So you run like a user test and see how things are changing when it's invisible, and then look at the distribution of individual companies to understand like what percentage of companies like this change. And the last couple of problems here, randomization is really random, right? If you have a checkerboard and you throw a bunch of marbles on it, it's very unlikely that you get one marble on each cell. And this applies to experimentation as well, and it's especially tough in B2B. Again, you have small sample size and high skew. So if we look at this, this chart here, we're looking at who's in test and who's in control. And what you'll note is we have two really big companies that both happen to be in control. This pretty much means this experiment is completely ruined. You will not be able to interpret this well. What do you do? So generally, you want to do some kind of stratified sampling. And this is actually a solved problem, and I'm very happy to have one here near the end. That is a solved problem, because I feel like I didn't have good answers otherwise. But what you can do is when you are assigning, you stratify as you go. So you make sure that you have kind of pairs between different sizes. This is really expensive to do. So fortunately, if you have like real-time allocation, having a service making network calls, it just adds a lot of issues. What people often do is they run an analysis beforehand and provide just a hard-coded list of IDs for who's in which segment. For us, our technique is we actually, again, since B2B metrics are very stable, we run 1,000 salts on your pre-experiment data and find the best one. So a salt is used in randomization so that each experiment has a different randomization. And so you can find one that balances things and just use that one. And we've seen that be really, really effective. So this is a almost solved problem. It's not perfect, but it's something to be really, really careful when you're doing your own analysis if you start doing this, to look out for, okay, where are the top 5 biggest customers? And for those who know statistics, it's not that uncommon. They'd all be in the same group. Last is heterogeneous effects. Heterogeneous effects means different populations respond differently. This is often an issue in B2C. Maybe people in one country are different than another. In B2B, it is critical. If your companies that are in one industry behave differently than another in your test, you need to know about that. If you're slowly regressing a core segment over time without realizing it, you're going to get in a lot of trouble over time. Normally, what you want to do is set up automated monitoring on this. I'm helping myself here and ending on the more solved problems. So things like differential impact detection techniques, where you're basically running tests on the differences between two groups' results, are really helpful. The other way to do this is just have it set up in your pre-planning of your analysis of what are we going to look at for our cuts. So what are the takeaways? I kind of ran through a bunch of problems as well as some solutions or not solutions for them. But I think there's a couple takeaways that apply to everyone and not just B2B. One is organizational level randomization, or specifically what to do when you are assigning and measuring different things. Smaller sample sizes are going to be an issue. You're going to have to deal with skew. You probably want to normalize things, and you probably have to figure out metric plans. The second is just remember the fundamentals. I think people talk a lot about statistical techniques and fancy methodologies, but the most important things are to have good metrics, a good hypothesis, and be smart about power analysis. Last is understanding advanced techniques, but I think this is more of a toolkit thing. Understand what's out there. You don't need to be at the cutting edge for every experiment, but this is something you can respond to issues that you have with. So I'd encourage you to kind of keep that as your toolkit if you start in the space or if you just start experimenting at all. So thank you. I'd love to invite questions, and thank you for listening to me.
Okay, I'm coming around with the mic for questions as well. I saw a hand up here first, and I think we'll have time for about 3 questions, by the way. So I'm going to come over here. Sorry.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was really relatable. I have 2 questions. First, I'm in financial services, and our sales team is very close with the client relationship.
Yep.
Let's say, for example, we want to roll out one marketing campaign. And then often we have some difficulty to get on board both sales and marketing team on this kind of experiment because one, sales team don't want to expose only the campaign to certain clients. Mm-hmm. And 2, the marketing team, it's such a hard work from them. So they want to distribute to everybody, as many as possible. So we're having, we are trying to do this experiment. We are doing it, but sometimes it's difficult to get them on board to have test and control groups. In this case, I guess you have quite many experience like this. Do you have any tips to communicate with the stakeholders? That's the first question. And the second question is, let's say we did some kind of projects last year to drive some ROI. We did one methodology. And then second year, we thought that there's a better way to improve the accuracy, and we tried that, and let's say the output is actually, in terms of the ROI value, drop, but the accuracy increase. It kind of gives a bit of a, how do I say, it needs to be more accurate, but then the ROI gives a bit decreased value. Mm. So how do you handle this kind of case?
Yeah, so for the first question, I think organizational problems just are the hardest problems, especially when you have misaligned incentives like that. I think generally it is a socialization thing of getting buy-in that this measurement matters. And frankly, if you can't do that, you're just at a non-starter. But I think where I've seen this be successful is either from the grounds up, the teams can kind of understand why you're measuring and buy into that. The other way, which is kind of a weapon of last resort, is getting sort of escalation to people above them and having, the people controlling the budget understand, come in and say, well, okay, we're spending all this money. We need to understand why we're spending the money and if it's good. But yeah, no, it's a tricky problem. I don't have a super clean answer to that. For the second, I think it's an interesting question, and it comes up a lot, especially in AI recently, where this is something I ran into a lot when I was doing ML experiments at Meta, of offline and online results can be very different. A prompt evaluation you do will say, hey, this prompt's doing a lot better, and then you roll it out to users, and the actual user engagement is a lot worse. Or we've even seen cases of people say they like the response more, but the overall engagement goes down. Those are really hard to interpret sometimes. I think generally it's an opportunity to dig in a little bit and do a richer analysis on that experiment result of understanding, okay, like are there actual signals as to why this gap exists? And you also go into that knowing like there's going to be some noise, right? Unless you have really, really tight confidence intervals in your readout, it's possible there's noise within that. But I would say my first response to that would be like, try to figure out if you can see why there's a gap there. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Like hearing about experimentation here in the festival is always great. Question about when you have collect data over time and your users are more engaged or they ramp up and some start left in the experiment, new ones come up. And do you have any tips on or any technique or on how to leverage daily data when you compare just a single sample of a specific day versus the cumulative of users that start entering and dropping the experiment over time?
Yeah, so that's a really good question and a bad one to end on because I could talk for a while. So yeah, generally when you're doing experiments, you read some sort of cumulative result of over the course of our experiment, this was the total X. But you also, we generally recommend looking at both the daily view, so what were the results on each day, and we call it a days since exposure view of, based on when you were cohorted in, what was the change in your behavior. The reason for daily is mostly just understanding how variable this is over time. Like we've actually seen a lot of experiments in B2B where the change on the weekend is very different than the change during the weekday, and generally you have hopefully less engagement on weekends. The day since exposure view is really powerful for understanding novelty effects. I think very commonly the reason they have this view at Meta is people would be like, okay, I'm going to change the button to be red. And then everyone clicks on it the first day because they go, what is this button? And then the next day it's totally neutral. But if you look at the experiment after a week, you'll see some sort of effect from that novelty effect. So I would say cumulative should be the decision-making criteria, but the daily views are a really powerful way to debug and sort of, again, start to understand what's going on behind the scenes. Yeah. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. And then we've got one question at the back here as well.
Thank you. You initially introduced growth models, and I think much of the content in your presentation is around product and feature rollouts. But going back to marketing-led growth, how easy or what is the method to tap into organizational level data and do this sort of stratification, especially in scenarios where you're talking about website landing pages like you mentioned in your presentation?
Yeah, so is it more helpful to talk about like strategies for just working with the data there, or is it more about just organizationally setting those experiments up?
How to basically tap into or capture firmographic organizational data, because we don't have, it's a website, so it's anonymous, and we are looking at the top of the funnel acquisition, so unknown users basically.
Yeah, no, that's a good call out. These techniques are not created equal across the different arms. You're not going to be able to stratify if users are anonymous, right? Or you can, but it's not going to be useful. Like stratifying by country doesn't get you much because randomization probably gets you there anyways. I do think when we're talking about marketing, this is a really important space, and there's two sides to that. One is the more general marketing science, so that's running like geo-based tests for advertisement. But I think what you're talking about is optimizing websites, right? Or like optimizing that landing page when people come in.
Yeah, so for a B2B digital website, how can it optimize based on companies visiting rather than users?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. No, that's going to be tricky. I think generally what we see is forcing a login is how people do this. But it has its own concerns, right? Because if your intervention comes before that, you're going to have drop-off before people even get to the company. That's a really good question. I don't have an immediate answer for you.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I promised you 3 questions and I gave you 3 questions, but I just wanted to say a massive thank you to Craig for that session. And if you do have any final questions for Craig, obviously don't completely swarm him, but you can come and find him at the end of this. And I just want to say, hands up, who's ready for some coffee? Yes, I am. So we've got a coffee break downstairs. We've got our sponsor stands as well. So we'll be back here at exactly 11 o'clock. So have a great coffee break. Thank you, everyone.